Welcome to Untold Stories of Freddie Mercury. If this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And now, let's dive into today's unforgettable story. The summer of 1986 was blazing hot in Budapest, and Queen had just delivered one of their most electrifying performances behind the Iron Curtain. As the final notes of We Are the Champions echoed through the packed stadium, something extraordinary was about to unfold that would become part of rock and roll folklore forever. Freddie Mercury stood at the edge of the stage, his chest heaving from the intensity of the show, sweat glistening under the harsh stage lights. The crowd of over 80,000 Hungarian fans erupted in thunderous applause, their voices creating a wall of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the venue. This wasn't just any concert. This was a historic moment, one of the first major Western rock performances in communist Hungary, and the energy was absolutely electric. The security arrangements for this groundbreaking show had been unprecedented. Hungarian authorities, nervous about hosting such a massive Western cultural event, had deployed an army of police officers and security personnel throughout the venue. Their instructions were crystal clear. Maintain order at all costs, keep the fans at a safe distance from the performers, and ensure that no unauthorized contact occurred between the audience and the band members. As Queen took their final bows, the crowd's enthusiasm reached fever pitch. Fans pressed against the barriers, their faces illuminated by pure joy and disbelief that they were witnessing their heroes in person. Many had traveled hundreds of miles, some had waited years for this moment, and the emotion was palpable in every corner of the stadium. Freddie, ever the showman, couldn't help but be moved by the overwhelming response. He had performed in front of countless audiences around the world, from Wembley Stadium to Madison Square Garden. But there was something uniquely special about this Hungarian crowd. Their appreciation felt deeper, more meaningful. These were people who had been starved of Western rock music for decades, and their gratitude was written across every face in the audience. As the band prepared to leave the stage, Freddie noticed a young woman in the front row. She couldn't have been more than 20, with tears streaming down her face as she clutched a homemade Queen banner. Her eyes were locked on Freddie with such intensity, such pure admiration, that it stopped him in his tracks. This wasn't the usual screaming fan hysteria he was accustomed to. This was something deeper, more profound. The girl had somehow managed to position herself right at the barrier, despite the heavy security presence. She wore a simple white t-shirt with Queen, written in what appeared to be hand-drawn letters, and her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail that had come loose during the excitement of the show. What struck Freddie most was the look in her eyes. Not just excitement, but genuine emotion, as if this moment represented something life-changing for her. Without thinking, Freddie began walking toward her section of the barrier. His bandmates, Brian May, Roger Taylor, and John Deacon, had already started heading backstage, but something compelled Freddie to stay, to acknowledge this particular fan who had touched something deep within him. The security team immediately noticed Freddie's movement toward the crowd. A burly police officer, his uniform crisp despite the heat, positioned himself directly between Freddie and the barrier. The officer's face was stern, his posture rigid with authority. He had his orders, and those orders didn't include allowing any interaction between the performers and the audience, no matter how innocent it might seem. But Freddie Mercury had never been one to follow conventional rules, especially when it came to connecting with his fans. The young woman at the barrier represented everything he loved about performing, the pure, unfiltered joy that music could bring to people's lives. In that moment, protocol and security concerns seemed insignificant compared to the human connection that was calling to him. The stage was set for a confrontation that would become legendary, a moment that would perfectly encapsulate Freddie's rebellious spirit and his unwavering dedication to his fans. The tension in the air became almost tangible as Freddie continued his approach toward the barrier, his eyes never leaving the young Hungarian woman who had captured his attention. The police officer, a man in his 40s with graying temples and the weathered face of someone who had seen decades of crowd control, stepped forward with practiced authority. His hand moved instinctively to his belt, not reaching for any weapon, but positioning himself in a way that made his intentions crystal clear. The officer had been briefing his team all week about this concert. The Hungarian government had taken enormous political risks allowing Queen to perform, and any incident could have international ramifications. His superiors had made it abundantly clear that maintaining order wasn't just about crowd safety. It was about proving that Hungary could handle Western cultural events without chaos erupting. Freddie, however, seemed completely oblivious to the political undercurrents swirling around him. His focus remained laser-sharp on the emotional connection he felt with this particular fan. As he drew closer, he could see more details that made her story even more compelling. Her homemade Queen t-shirt wasn't just hand-drawn, it was meticulously crafted, with each letter carefully outlined and filled in with what appeared to be fabric paint. Someone had spent hours, perhaps days, creating this tribute. The young woman's tears had intensified as she realized Freddie was walking directly toward her. Her hands trembled as she gripped the metal barrier, her knuckles white with the intensity of her hold. Behind her, other fans had noticed Freddie's approach and began pressing forward, creating a ripple effect of excitement that threatened to overwhelm the security arrangements. The police officer raised his hand in a clear stop gesture, his face set in stone. He had dealt with countless performers over the years, from folk singers to classical musicians, and he knew how to assert authority without creating a scene. His uniform was immaculate, his posture rigid with the confidence of someone who expected immediate compliance with his directives. But as Freddie continued forward, something remarkable began to happen. The crowd, sensing the developing confrontation, started to quiet down. The deafening roar that had filled the stadium moments before began to fade into an expectant hush. Thousands of people seemed to collectively hold their breath, instinctively understanding that they were witnessing something significant. The young woman at the barrier seemed caught between disbelief and overwhelming emotion. Her eyes darted between Freddie and the imposing police officer, as if she couldn't quite process that this moment was really happening. She had probably dreamed of meeting her idol countless times, but never imagined it would unfold under such dramatic circumstances. Freddie's stage persona had always been larger than life, but in this moment, something more authentic emerged. The theatrical gestures and flamboyant movements that characterized his performances gave way to something more genuine, more human. His approach toward the barrier wasn't the calculated move of an entertainer. It was the instinctive response of someone who recognized a kindred spirit in the crowd. The police officer's training kicked in as he assessed the situation. He could see that Freddie wasn't backing down, and he could feel the weight of thousands of eyes watching his every move. The crowd's energy had shifted from celebration to anticipation, and he knew that his next actions would either defuse the situation or potentially escalate it into something much more complicated. Behind the scenes, other security personnel had noticed the developing standoff. Radio chatter began buzzing between various checkpoints around the stadium as supervisors tried to understand what was happening on stage. The concert was supposed to be winding down smoothly, with the band making their exit and the crowd beginning their orderly departure. Instead, an unexpected drama was unfolding that no one had planned for. The young woman's friends, positioned nearby in the crowd, watched with a mixture of excitement and concern. They could see the determination in Freddie's eyes, but they could also see the unwavering stance of the police officer. The cultural and political implications of this moment were probably lost on them. They simply saw their friend about to have the encounter of a lifetime, if only the authorities would allow it to happen. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the boundaries between authority and human compassion, between protocol and spontaneous connection. The moment of truth arrived as Freddie Mercury came within arm's reach of the barrier, his eyes locked with those of the young Hungarian woman who had unknowingly become the center of this unfolding drama. The police officer, his jaw set with determination, positioned himself directly in Freddie's path, creating a human wall between the rock star and his devoted fan. What happened next would be talked about for decades to come. Instead of confronting the officer with anger or frustration, Freddie did something completely unexpected. He stopped, tilted his head slightly, and studied the policeman's face with genuine curiosity. There was no trace of the theatrical arrogance that some might have expected from a global superstar being denied access to his fans. The officer, prepared for resistance or argument, found himself momentarily disarmed by Freddie's calm demeanor. He had dealt with difficult performers before, artists who threw tantrums when their demands weren't met, celebrities who believed their fame entitled them to special treatment. But Freddie's response was different. There was something almost respectful in his pause, as if he was genuinely considering the officer's position. The crowd watched in fascination as this silent standoff continued. The young woman at the barrier seemed frozen in time, her tear-stained face reflecting a mixture of hope and heartbreak. She had come so close to meeting her idol, only to have protocol potentially snatch the moment away from her. Freddie's mind was working quickly, processing not just the immediate situation, but the broader context of what this concert meant. He understood that this performance in Hungary was about more than entertainment. It was about cultural exchange, about breaking down barriers between East and West. The last thing he wanted was to create an international incident over a simple gesture of appreciation for a fan. But as he looked at the young woman's face, then back at the stern police officer, something shifted in Freddie's expression. A slow smile began to spread across his features, not the practiced grin of a performer, but something more genuine, more mischievous. It was the smile of someone who had just figured out how to solve an impossible puzzle. The officer noticed the change in Freddie's demeanor and tensed slightly, unsure what to expect next. His training had prepared him for confrontation, for defiance, for the typical celebrity meltdown. It hadn't prepared him for whatever was brewing behind Freddie Mercury's increasingly amused expression. The stadium's atmosphere had become electric with anticipation. Even the other band members, who had been heading backstage, had stopped to watch the unfolding scene. Brian May, Roger Taylor, and John Deacon stood in the wings, equally curious about how their flamboyant frontman would handle this delicate situation. The young woman's breathing had become shallow with emotion. She could see Freddie so close, could almost reach out and touch him, but the imposing figure of the police officer stood like an immovable mountain between them. Her friends pressed closer behind her, offering silent support while trying to get a better view of the historic moment unfolding before their eyes. Security personnel throughout the venue had their attention focused on this single point of tension. Radio communications buzzed with updates as supervisors tried to decide whether to intervene or let the situation play out naturally. The political implications weighed heavily on everyone's minds. This concert was supposed to demonstrate Hungary's ability to host Western cultural events without incident. Freddie's pause stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity to everyone watching. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant sound of equipment being moved backstage and the collective breathing of thousands of people waiting to see what would happen next. Then, in a moment that would be retold countless times over the years, Freddie Mercury did something that no one in the stadium could have predicted. Instead of trying to push past the police officer or argue his case, he slowly extended his arms toward the stern-faced man in uniform. The gesture was unmistakable. Freddie was offering the policeman a hug. The officer's eyes widened in complete bewilderment. In all his years of crowd control and security work, nothing had prepared him for this scenario. He had been trained to handle aggression, defiance, and celebrity tantrums, but a warm embrace from one of the world's biggest rock stars was entirely outside his realm of experience. The crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. A collective gasp rippled through the stadium as thousands of people processed what they were witnessing. The young woman at the barrier covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes growing wide with disbelief and delight. This wasn't just unexpected, it was revolutionary. Freddie's arms remained outstretched, his expression patient and genuinely warm. There was no mockery in his gesture, no attempt to embarrass or undermine the officer's authority. Instead, there was something profoundly human about the moment, a recognition that beneath the uniforms and protocols, they were all just people trying to do their jobs and connect with one another. The police officer found himself in an impossible position. His training told him to maintain professional distance, to uphold the barriers between authority and civilian, between order and chaos. But Freddie's gesture was so unexpected, so genuinely kind, that it completely disarmed his defensive instincts. Around the stadium, other security personnel watched in fascination as their colleagues struggled with this unprecedented situation. Some reached for their radios, unsure whether to report this development to their supervisors. Others simply stared, equally captivated by the unfolding drama. The officer's face began to soften almost imperceptibly. The rigid lines of authority started to give way to something more human, more vulnerable. He glanced around at the crowd, then back at Freddie's patient, welcoming expression. The rock star hadn't moved, hadn't pressured him, hadn't made the moment about winning or losing. He had simply offered connection. The young Hungarian woman watched with tears streaming down her face as she realized what Freddie was doing. He wasn't just trying to get past the officer to reach her. He was demonstrating something far more profound. He was showing that barriers could be dissolved not through force or confrontation, but through unexpected kindness and human recognition. The silence in the stadium had become almost sacred. 80,000 people held their collective breath, sensing that they were witnessing something that transcended entertainment, something that spoke to the very heart of what it meant to be human. This wasn't just a rock concert anymore. It was a moment of pure, unscripted humanity. Freddie's patience seemed infinite. He stood there with his arms open, not demanding, not insisting, simply offering. His body language conveyed complete respect for the officer's position, while simultaneously inviting him to step beyond the confines of protocol into something more meaningful. The officer's internal struggle was visible on his face. Years of training warred with the simple human desire to respond to genuine kindness. His colleagues watched. The crowd watched. The world seemed to watch as he grappled with a decision that would define not just this moment, but how he would remember this night for the rest of his life. The young woman at the barrier whispered something under her breath, a prayer or a wish that this magical moment would somehow find its perfect resolution. The transformation that occurred next would become the stuff of legend. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, the police officer's rigid posture began to soften. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and something remarkable happened in his eyes. The stern mask of authority gave way to genuine human emotion. Slowly, almost hesitantly, the officer stepped forward and accepted Freddie's embrace. The moment their arms wrapped around each other, the entire stadium erupted in the most thunderous applause anyone had ever heard. 80,000 voices rose as one, creating a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the venue and echo across the Hungarian countryside. The hug lasted only a few seconds, but its impact was immeasurable. When they separated, both men were smiling. The officer with a look of wonder and disbelief, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened, and Freddie with the genuine joy of someone who had just witnessed the power of human connection triumph over institutional barriers. The young woman at the barrier was sobbing openly now, but these were tears of pure joy. She had come to see her musical hero perform, but instead she had witnessed something far more profound, a moment that demonstrated the very values that Queen's music had always championed: unity, acceptance, and the power of love to overcome division. What happened next was even more extraordinary. The police officer, still somewhat dazed by the unexpected turn of events, stepped aside and gestured toward the barrier. His meaning was clear. He was giving Freddie permission to approach his fan. The gesture was small, but monumentally significant, representing a choice to prioritize human connection over rigid protocol. Freddie's face lit up with genuine gratitude as he acknowledged the officer's gesture. He placed a gentle hand on the man's shoulder, a silent thank you that conveyed more respect and appreciation than any words could have expressed. Then, with the officer's blessing, he approached the young woman who had started this entire extraordinary sequence of events. The crowd watched in rapt attention as Freddie reached the barrier and extended his arms toward the tearful fan. She seemed almost afraid to believe it was really happening, her hands trembling as she reached out to accept the embrace she had probably dreamed about countless times. When Freddie's arms wrapped around her, the young woman's composure completely dissolved. She buried her face in his shoulder, her body shaking with the intensity of her emotion. This wasn't just meeting a celebrity. This was a moment of pure human connection that validated her love for the music, her dedication as a fan, and her belief in the power of art to bring people together. The embrace lasted longer than the one with the police officer, and Freddie seemed genuinely moved by the young woman's emotional response. He held her gently but firmly, allowing her to have her moment without rushing or making her feel self-conscious about her tears. Around them, the crowd continued to cheer, but the sound had taken on a different quality. It was no longer just excitement about seeing their heroes perform. It was celebration of something deeper, something that spoke to the very best of human nature. People were witnessing kindness triumph over authority, connection overcome barriers, and love dissolve the artificial divisions that too often separate us from one another. The police officer stood nearby, watching the scene with an expression that mixed professional vigilance with genuine warmth. His colleagues throughout the venue had relaxed their stances, sensing that this moment posed no threat to security or order. If anything, it had created a sense of unity and goodwill that made their jobs easier. Other fans near the barrier reached out hopefully, and Freddie, energized by the positive response, began moving along the front row, shaking hands, accepting small gifts, and sharing brief moments of connection with as many people as he could reach. The police officer followed at a respectful distance, no longer an obstacle but a protector, ensuring that these precious interactions could continue safely. The concert had officially ended, but something far more meaningful had begun. As Freddie continued his impromptu meet and greet along the barrier, word of what had transpired began spreading like wildfire throughout the venue. Security personnel who had missed the initial confrontation were hearing breathless accounts from their colleagues, each retelling adding new layers of amazement to an already incredible story. The young Hungarian woman, still glowing from her encounter with Freddie, found herself surrounded by friends and strangers alike, all wanting to hear about her experience. Her homemade Queen t-shirt had become a symbol of the evening's magic, and people were asking to touch it, as if some of Freddie's warmth might have transferred to the fabric during their embrace. The police officer who had started the evening as an obstacle had become an unlikely hero in his own right. Other security personnel approached him with newfound respect, recognizing that his decision to step aside had transformed what could have been an ugly confrontation into something beautiful. His radio crackled with messages from supervisors wanting to understand what had happened, but he found himself struggling to put the experience into words. Meanwhile, backstage, the other members of Queen were getting second-hand reports of Freddie's latest act of spontaneous humanity. Brian May shook his head with familiar affection, recognizing this as classic Freddie behavior. Roger Taylor and John Deacon exchanged knowing looks. They had witnessed their frontman's ability to connect with people countless times, but this seemed to be something special even by Freddie's standards. The venue's management team was in crisis mode, trying to determine whether protocols had been violated and what the political implications might be. Phone calls were being made to government officials, reports were being written, and damage control strategies were being discussed. But as more details emerged about what had actually happened, the tone of these conversations began to shift from concern to amazement. Hungarian media representatives who had been covering the concert found themselves with a story far more compelling than a simple rock performance. Photographers who had captured the moment of the hug between Freddie and the police officer knew they had something extraordinary on their hands. The images would soon travel around the world, becoming iconic symbols of music's power to bridge cultural and political divides. The crowd's energy had transformed completely. What had begun as post-concert excitement had evolved into something approaching euphoria. People weren't just talking about the music they had heard, they were discussing the humanity they had witnessed. Strangers were embracing each other, inspired by the example they had just seen. The young woman's story was already taking on mythical proportions as it spread through the crowd. Each retelling emphasized different aspects: her tears, her homemade shirt, the way Freddie had looked at her, the gentleness of their embrace. She had become the focal point of a story that was rapidly becoming legend. The police officer found himself in the unusual position of being congratulated by his colleagues for his handling of the situation. What had initially seemed like a potential security breach was now being praised as an example of flexible, intelligent crowd management. His superiors were beginning to realize that his decision to allow the interaction had actually enhanced Hungary's reputation rather than damaging it. As the stadium began to empty, small groups of fans lingered. Reluctant to leave the site of such an extraordinary evening, they gathered in clusters, sharing their own perspectives on what they had witnessed, trying to process the significance of what had unfolded before their eyes. The story was already beginning its journey beyond the confines of the stadium, carried by every person who had witnessed it, destined to be retold in countless variations across continents and decades. In the days that followed the Budapest concert, the story of Freddie's encounter with the police officer and the young fan began to take on a life of its own. Hungarian newspapers, initially cautious about how to report on the Western rock concert, found themselves with a human interest story that transcended political boundaries and cultural differences. The photographs captured that night became some of the most powerful images of the 1980s. The moment when Freddie extended his arms toward the bewildered police officer was frozen in time, showing two men from completely different worlds finding common ground through an unexpected gesture of kindness. The image of their embrace became a symbol of hope during a time when East-West tensions still ran high. The young woman whose emotional response had started the entire sequence found her life changed overnight. Local media sought her out for interviews, wanting to hear her perspective on the magical evening. She spoke with quiet dignity about what the experience had meant to her, how Freddie's music had sustained her through difficult times, and how his gesture of reaching out to her had validated her belief in the power of art to transform lives. The police officer, initially concerned about potential disciplinary action for deviating from protocol, discovered instead that he had become something of a local hero. His superiors, recognizing the positive international attention the incident had generated for Hungary, commended him for his judgment and flexibility. The story was being told around the world as an example of Hungarian hospitality and openness to cultural exchange. International media picked up the story with enthusiasm. Music journalists who had covered countless rock concerts found themselves writing about something far more significant than typical concert reviews. The incident was being discussed in the context of music's ability to break down barriers, the power of spontaneous human connection, and the way authentic gestures could transcend political and cultural divisions. Queen's management team, initially nervous about any deviation from planned security protocols, quickly realized they had witnessed something that enhanced the band's reputation immeasurably. The story reinforced everything that Queen's music stood for: inclusivity, celebration of human diversity, and the belief that love and understanding could overcome any obstacle. Fan clubs around the world began sharing the story, each adding their own interpretations and emotional responses. The incident became part of Queen folklore, joining the ranks of legendary moments like Live Aid and Wembley Stadium performances. But this story was different. It wasn't about musical prowess or theatrical spectacle, but about genuine human kindness. The ripple effects extended far beyond the music world. The story was being cited in discussions about diplomacy, cultural exchange, and the role of artists as unofficial ambassadors. Political commentators noted how a simple gesture of humanity had accomplished more for East-West relations than months of formal negotiations. Back in Budapest, the venue where the concert had taken place became something of a pilgrimage site for Queen fans. The exact spot where the encounter had occurred was marked by flowers and handwritten notes from visitors who wanted to pay tribute to the moment when barriers had been dissolved through unexpected kindness. The young woman kept her homemade Queen t-shirt as a treasured memento, but more importantly, she carried with her the memory of being seen, acknowledged, and embraced by someone she admired. The experience had validated her belief that the connection between artist and audience could be genuine and transformative. The police officer found that his perspective on his job had been fundamentally altered. The experience had reminded him that behind every uniform, every protocol, and every barrier was a human being capable of choice, compassion, and connection. He began approaching his duties with a new understanding of when rules should be enforced and when humanity should take precedence. Years passed, and the story of that magical night in Budapest continued to grow in significance and meaning. The young Hungarian woman, now a successful professional with a family of her own, would often tell her children about the evening when she learned that kindness could triumph over authority and that genuine human connection could dissolve any barrier. The police officer, who had retired from active duty, became something of a local celebrity in his own right. He would often be invited to speak at community events, sharing his perspective on the importance of choosing humanity over rigid protocol when the situation called for it. His grandchildren grew up hearing the story of the night their grandfather hugged a rock star and helped create a moment of pure magic. The photographs from that evening had become iconic, displayed in museums dedicated to rock and roll history and cultural exchange. Art critics analyzed the images, noting how they captured a perfect moment of spontaneous human connection that transcended the boundaries of entertainment, politics, and social convention. Freddie Mercury himself would reference the Budapest incident in later interviews, describing it as one of his most meaningful experiences as a performer. He spoke about how the encounter had reinforced his belief that music was ultimately about bringing people together, breaking down the artificial barriers that society created between individuals. The story became part of Queen's official legacy, included in documentaries, biographies, and retrospective articles about the band's impact on popular culture. But more than that, it became a touchstone for discussions about the power of unexpected kindness and the importance of choosing connection over conflict. Music historians would later cite the Budapest incident as a perfect example of how rock and roll served as a cultural bridge during the Cold War era. The story demonstrated how individual acts of humanity could accomplish what formal diplomacy sometimes could not, creating genuine understanding and goodwill between people from different worlds. The venue in Budapest eventually erected a small plaque commemorating the concert and the extraordinary moment that had occurred there. Fans from around the world would visit, leaving flowers, notes, and small tributes to the memory of an evening when barriers had been dissolved through simple human kindness. The young woman's homemade Queen t-shirt was eventually donated to a rock and roll museum, where it became one of the most popular exhibits. Visitors would stand before the simple, hand-drawn shirt and read the story of how it had been worn during one of the most beautiful moments in rock history. The ripple effects of that single evening continued to spread across decades. The story was shared in schools as an example of how individual choices could create positive change. It was referenced in discussions about conflict resolution, cultural diplomacy, and the power of art to bring people together. As the years went by, the story took on almost mythical proportions, but those who had been there that night knew that the reality had been even more powerful than any legend could capture. They had witnessed something rare and precious, a moment when all the artificial barriers that separate human beings had simply melted away, leaving only connection, understanding, and love. The legacy of that Budapest evening lived on in every act of unexpected kindness, every moment when someone chose connection over conflict, every time a barrier was dissolved through simple human recognition. Freddie Mercury's gesture had created more than just a memorable concert moment. It had created a template for how human beings could choose to treat one another. The story became eternal proof that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but with a simple offer of embrace, extended with genuine warmth to someone who least expects it. If you enjoyed today's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming emotional and inspiring tales about Freddie's life and legacy. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and often your ideas inspire our next episode. See you next time.